Well, thank you, Shmuel. Good afternoon. I'm going to try to pull the focus back a bit. Our panel title implies that indoctrination is the key to radicalism. If we could shut down the jihadi websites and silence the radical preachers, if we could get the Saudis to stop funding extremists, if we could fix the textbooks, the radical fever would subside. But there are other views. There are those who say that the heart of the problem is despotic governments. If there were more democracy, less Western backing for kings and emirs and presidents for life, the radical fever would subside. And others say that the heart of the problem is America's unconditional support for Israel and U.S. military campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan. If the U.S. were to take its armies out of these lands, if the U.S. were to force Israel to end its occupation of Palestinian territory, the radical fever would subside. Now, as between these three explanations, you might prefer one to another. I myself have had a running debate with people who think that anger at Israel drives al-Qaeda or recruitment to al-Qaeda. Typical is this view expressed last week by a noted prominent analyst in Washington, and I quote him, "We can separate al-Qaeda from the vast majority of Muslims by advancing a just and lasting peace that Palestinians accept," end of quote. Now, I don't know what the Palestinians would accept, and I think the vast majority of Muslims are already separated from al-Qaeda. But in places like Yemen and Afghanistan and Somalia, where al-Qaeda is most deeply entrenched, a just and lasting peace for the Palestinians wouldn't make a shred of difference. But the indoctrination explanation and the lack of democracy explanation also, I think, underestimate the problem by suggesting that our own policies can go very far to change the dynamic. They can't, and let me explain why. The societies in which radicalism thrives differ from ours in many ways, but one way is crucial. The median age in Germany is 44. In the UK, it's 40. In the US, it's 37. In Israel, it's 29. In Turkey, it's 28. Now, that's for perspective. In Iraq, it's 19. In Afghanistan, Somalia, Yemen, and Gaza, the median age is 17. When you get below a median age of 20, you're talking about places where Islamist radicalization is taking place on a massive scale. The biggest radicalizer is fertility that hovers at 6 or 7, and masses of economically superfluous young men of fighting age between 15 and 29. Now, German demographer Gunnar Heinzen has a rule of thumb that when 15 to 29-year-olds make up more than 30% of the population, violence ensues. I'd put it higher, at 40%, which is still exactly what you have in Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, Yemen, and Gaza. If the state can't control these young men, someone else will. And if society can't offer dignified pursuits for the 4th and 5th and 6th sons, someone else will. And it's not just the frustration of poverty, it's just as much a shortage of status. Osama bin Laden lacked for nothing, but his father, who was Saudi Arabia's biggest contractor, married 22 times and had about 55 children. Osama bin Laden was number 17. Radical Islam is a way for the superfluous sons to enter history. So radical Islam it answers a demand among frustrated young men. It doesn't create it. How should that affect the West's approach to the problem? Well, first, let's not delude ourselves about the prospects of counter-radicalization. Afghanistan and Yemen will almost double their populations between now and 2030. What will 28 million more Afghans and 20 million more Yemenis do? What about the nearly 80 million more Pakistanis who will be added by 2030? This explosive growth will drive radicalization through another generation at least and push it into Europe and America through emigration. But second, there's hope. By 2030, these societies will have passed through the youth bulge. Fertility is already falling, in some places steeply. And when it falls, the radicals will lose their pool of recruits. I think the present example is Iran, where a revolt is brewing, as we heard in the last panel, against the agenda of Ahmadinejad and the hardliners. It's also a place where fertility has dropped from 7 to below replacement, that is below 2, which is as steep a drop as China's. Aging populations reject radical agendas, and the Middle East is no different. Now, eventually, this will happen among the Palestinians too, but it will happen faster if the West stops providing pronatal subsidies for Palestinians with refugee status. Those subsidies are one reason why in the 10 years from 1997 to 2007, Gaza's population grew by an astonishing 40%. At that rate, Gaza's population will double by 2030 to 3 million. Israel's present sanctions on Gaza have a political aim, undermine the Hamas regime, but if they also break Gaza's runaway population growth, and there is some evidence that they have, that might begin to crack the culture of martyrdom, which demands a constant supply of superfluous young men. That is rising to the real challenge of radical indoctrination and treating it at its root.